right, good morning, everybody. We are in Joshua chapter 15 this morning. Joshua chapter 15. We are hopping over to the west side of the Jordan. Over the last couple of chapters, we have heard the conquest and the inheritance on the east side of the Jordan recounted for us. And as we're going through, these few chapters with a lot of long lists of city names, place names, one of the things that I want to do to make this fruitful for us, because as we go through, there's going to be like 90% of these names we're not even going to recognize. Like, I've never heard that in the Bible before. And at least half of them we will never ever hear again, by the way. And so it's like, we read all these names, and our eyes glaze over like a Krispy Kreme donut, and, we don't get anything out of it. For us to make this fruitful, I want us to spend a little bit of time at least getting ourselves more familiar with the layout of Israel. And I don't know if you had Bible class teachers who did this with you as kids. Coming up, I never really had a good formal, hey, let's learn the layout of Israel kind of thing. So this has always been something I've been really bad at personally. Like, if you were to ask me, all right, where's the tribe of Dan? I got no idea. I got to open up my little reference map in the back of my Bible. The one thing that I'd like us to do is we're going through, because we're going to get more Israelite history, and it's going to involve needing to know different places within Israel. I think it'd be fun and be useful for us to practice getting a handle on where the different tribes are. Right? Some of them, we just know through common use. Like, we all know where Judah is, right? Oh. Maybe, yes, no. One of my aims for this, and part of this is I was the kid that enjoyed going to school when I was younger. So this is the kind of stuff I have fun with anyway. And I hope I can make it fun for you guys. At the beginning of each class, while we're going through this part of Joshua, I want us to review the placement of the tribes that we have been over so far. All right, so we've gone over the 3 tribes, or 2.5 tribes, east of the Jordan. Let's start by naming them first. Which 2.5 tribes are east of the Jordan River? Sorry? Manasseh. All right, Manasseh, that's the half tribe. What are the other 2 tribes? Loud, because my hearing's real bad. What are the other 2 tribes? Gad is one of them. And then the last one is Reuben. Okay, so let's work on placing them. First off, all right, in this very expertly drawn map of Israel that I've got up on the board, wink, wink. All right, I've got this black line. Here's the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Dead Sea. There's this line running between them. That's the Jordan River. There's also some river north of the Sea of Galilee. And on the east side of that, we have these 3 colored blobs that represent the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan. Now, since this is our first week doing this, let's see if any of us remember where any of these places are, or if we're any good at guessing where these places are. So let's try to do this without looking at the reference maps in the back of our Bibles, or front, or whatever. All right. By the way, you've got a 30% chance on this. And your odds will just get better as we go along this morning. The big red territory on the far north. This was formerly the kingdom of Bashan, ruled by King Og, defeated, of course, by Israel, led by Moses, before he died. Which tribe got the kingdom of Bashan? It was not Gad. So now you've got a 50% chance. It wasn't Reuben either, so now you've got a 100% chance of being right. It is East Manasseh. Now, if you had asked me that yesterday, I would have probably got it wrong too, by the way. It is something that it doesn't take long to get this once you start doing this. But just the process of drawing out this map has been helpful, at least to me. All right, so now we've got two more. We've got the one on the far south side. Its western border is the Dead Sea. We've got one to the north of it. One of its borders is named as the Sea of Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. Do we remember which is which? We've got the purple blob and the green blob. Do we remember which is which? It's either Reuben or Gad. Let's start with purple in the south. It's Reuben. And then the other one is Gad. All right, now, time to check our work. I really hope I'm right on this, or I'm going to look really silly. Okay, good. We've got it right. Reuben, Gad, the eastern half-tribe of Manasseh. All right, so we'll keep doing that as we go along. The tribe that we have started reading about in chapter 14, and that we're going to continue reading about in chapter 15, is Judah. And before we jump into the text, let's go ahead and place Judah on the map. Which of these blobs, and it might be, the further back it might be harder to distinguish some of these colors. We've got red here, orange, of a light blue, purple. There's another red one in the north, another blue, orange, purple, green. Which of these blobs is Judah?
It's down south. That's where Jerusalem and Bethlehem.
Yes, down south. Which of these ones in the south? Red, orange, or blue? Red. This is Judah. And what you notice about Judah compared to most of the rest of them is that it's really big. In fact, that's going to be something that's emphasized to us over the course of today's reading, is that Judah is very large. So let's go ahead and start in Joshua chapter 15, verse 1. The allotment for the tribe of the people of Judah, according to their clans, reached southward to the boundary of Edom, to the wilderness of Zin at the farthest south. And their south boundary ran from the end of the Salt Sea, from the bay that faces southward. It goes out southward of the ascent of Akrabim, passes along to Zin, goes up south of Kadesh Barnea, along by Hezron, up to Adar, turns about to Karka, passes along to Hezmon, goes out by the brook of Egypt, so that puts us out to the west here, the brook of Egypt, and comes to its end at the sea. All right, so the southern border of Judah is basically desert, it's wilderness, and it runs from the Red Sea on the east to the Mediterranean Sea on the west. Let's see. The east boundary is the Salt Sea to the mouth of the Jordan. All right, so that boundary is really easy. You just go from the bottom of the Dead Sea up to the top of the Dead Sea, and that's Judah's eastern border. Let's see. And the boundary on the north side runs from the bay of the sea at the mouth of the Jordan, and the boundary goes up to Beth Hogla and passes along north of Beth Arba, and the boundary goes up to the stone of Bohan, the son of Reuben. We don't know where that is, by the way. And the boundary goes up to Debir from the valley of Achor, and so northward, turning toward Gilgal, which is opposite the ascent of Adumim, which is on the south side of the valley. And the boundary passes along to the waters of En Shemesh and ends at En Rogel. Then the boundary goes up by the valley of the son of Hinnom at the southern shoulder of the Jebusite, or your translation might say Jebus, or the Jebusite city, that is Jerusalem. And the boundary goes up to the top of the mountain that lies over against the valley of Hinnom on the west, at the northern end of the valley of Rephaim. Then the boundary extends from the top of the mountain to the spring of the waters of Nephtoah, from there to the cities of Mount Ephron. Then the boundary bends around to Baalah, that is Kiryat Yarim, and to the boundary circles west of Baalah to Mount Seir, passes along to the northern shoulder of Mount Yarim, that is Chesalon, and goes down to Bet Shemesh and passes along by Timnah. The boundary goes out to the shoulder of the hill north of Ekron. Then the boundary bends around to Shikharon and passes along to Mount Baalah and goes out to Yabneel. Then the boundary comes to an end at the sea. And the west boundary was the Great Sea with its coastline. This is the boundary around the people of Judah according to their clans. All right, so we've got two boundaries that are really, really simple. You've got on the east side, it's just the Salt Sea. On the west side, it's just the Great Sea. Easily the most complex boundary is the northern boundary, because as we will learn, Judah butts up against two of the other tribes. And in fact, some of the cities on that boundary list will also be on the boundary lists of these other tribes. Ekron, over in the west, is on the boundary list for this tribe here on the northwest of Judah. Jerusalem is also on the boundary between Judah and this tribe on the northeast of Judah. And here's the interesting thing. All right, the boundary, if we go back up to verse 8, then the boundary goes up by the valley of the son of Hinnom at the southern shoulder of the Jebusite, that is Jerusalem. All right, so what does this boundary line imply to us about the placement of Jerusalem? And this will come out explicitly later in the text, by the way. Which of these two tribes is Jerusalem actually in? At least at this point. Is it in Judah? Now, we normally associate Jerusalem with Judah, but remember the text tells us that the boundary line comes up on the southern shoulder of Jerusalem. The boundary is south of Jerusalem. And on the other side of that boundary line is Judah. Jerusalem, at this point in Israel's history, is allotted to the tribe to the northeast of Judah, which we will get to when we get to. But it's interesting, like we've kind of pointed this out as we've gone along, that there's a lot of, at least for the boundaries between the tribes, there's a lot of back and forth between some of these cities. And we saw that east of the Jordan as well. All right. A lot of these place names to us, again, don't necessarily mean anything. To modern readers today, a lot of these places we do not know where they're at today. Like I pointed out, the stone of Bohan, the son of Reuben. We don't know anything about the stone of Bohan, the son of Reuben. Like, who is this guy Bohan? We have no idea. How did he get this stone in this place? No idea. It's something that they would have understood, but it's lost to us today. What we should get out of this, reading this today, is that Judah's prominence is on display. Right? It is, first off, it's listed first among the western tribes. The eastern tribes were listed first because Moses gave them their inheritance first, and the book is wanting us to tie together, to understand that Joshua's work west of the river is part and parcel with Moses' work east of the river. But out of the rest of the tribes, Judah is listed first, and its territory is given the most extensive description out of any of the ones that we are going to read. We should remember, by the way, that Judah is the one who receives the greatest blessing from his father Jacob. So talking about the man Judah. Let's get into some real brownie point stuff here. Who remembers, where does Judah fit in the birth order of Jacob's 12 sons? Rena?
He's number 4.
He's number 4. There we go. Rena's got the brownie points this morning. Judah was number 4. Now, how does Judah end up being most prominent if he is not the firstborn son, but is in fact the fourth-born son of Jacob? Y'all remember how Judah ended up with the prominence? Go ahead, Rena.
Well, the first one, Reuben,
Yeah.
he slept with his dad's wife.
Yes. Yes. So he was. Go ahead.
And the other two, I think, I think they were violent or something.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. Rena's on it this morning. So Reuben, you remember, it's a little short passage in Genesis. Reuben slept with one of his father's wives. We describe that as basically a play on control of the household. Something that was fairly typical in the ancient world. If you were trying to usurp power, one of the things that you started with was the wives. We see Absalom doing it later on with David's concubines. So Jacob kind of cuts Reuben out of things. All right, and Reuben, you'll notice, by the way, is given this rather small inheritance off on the corner of Israel, cut off practically from everybody else, right up against the borders of Moab. He's the firstborn son, but is probably one of the smallest tribes. The other two are who are the second and thirdborn sons? Simeon and Levi. And Jacob, it's a blessing that reads kind of like a curse. Right? Whenever we get to, I think it's in Genesis 49, where he's laying out all the blessings on his sons. And he condemns Simeon and Levi for being violent, because you remember what they did to the city of Shechem on account of their sister Dinah. Right? They tricked them all into getting circumcised and then went and killed them all while they were sore. Right? Hilarious story. And Jacob was really mad about it because it gave him a bad name in the land. So Simeon and Levi also kind of get cut out a little bit. Now, Levi, here's an easy one. Where's Levi's inheritance in all of this? They don't have an inheritance. Now, the Lord cuts a deal with them, right? They've got a special place in the whole scheme here, where the Lord is their inheritance, the sacrifices are their inheritance, most of the tithes, are their inheritance. But they have, and they'll get cities and pasture lands, but they have no tribal allotment of their own. Now, here's another tricky question for you. Where is Simeon in all of this? Down in Judah. All right, there's a weird thing going on here. All right, let's count up our blobs real quick. All right, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 blobs, which, 12 is the right number, except we know, all right, so another one of these blobs is going to be the other half tribe of Manasseh. And so that means that there's a tribe that is being excluded from the blobs here, and it's Simeon. Because as we're going to read later on, Simeon's inheritance falls entirely inside of the borders of Judah. And we talked about this when we were going through the census numbers in the book of Numbers. That Simeon, you'll remember Simeon's numbers decreased by like a whole bunch in between the two censuses in the book of Numbers. And we kind of look at the trajectory for the tribe of Simeon. And there's a point in the Old Testament where Simeon just kind of drops off the map. They just kind of disappear. You never hear about them again. And we're not really told what happens to them. Probably they get just absorbed into the tribe of Judah. And the entire area is given to be just Judah. But that's what happens. All right, so Reuben is kind of off on a corner somewhere. Levi has no inheritance. Simeon kind of sort of has an inheritance that ultimately gets swallowed up into Judah. Judah is the one that is most prominent. And that's the emphasis that we're supposed to get, really from all of this that we're going to read in chapter 15. Any questions or comments on any of the texts that we've just read or any of the things that we've just been over? Yes. Yeah, Judah is absolutely the hero of that part of the story. From Genesis 37 on, it's basically a big redemption arc for Judah. So, yeah, he's 100% the son of Jacob that we're supposed to look at and say, he's the good guy. He's the one we're supposed to be like and model ourselves after. All right, excellent point. So let's continue into verse 13, Joshua 15:13. According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb the son of Jephunneh a portion among the people of Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. And Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Shishai and Ahiman and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. And he went up from there against the inhabitants of Debir. Now the name of Debir formerly was Kiriath Shepher. And Caleb said, whoever strikes Kiriath Shepher and captures it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter as wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it. And he gave him Achsah his daughter as a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she got off her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water. And he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. All right, so the story circles back around to something that we've already read about in the last chapter. We read about Caleb's land grant in Judah and his conquest of that land grant. But here the story repeats that. And I say circles back around and repeats because, remember, the last time that we saw him, the chapter kind of brought that whole story to a close, right? Caleb goes to Joshua and reminds him of this land grant that the Lord promised him through Moses. And Joshua says, yeah, go take it. Caleb says he's going to strike the Anakim that are there. And at the end of that, the very last statement of chapter 14 is, the land had rest from war. All right, so we kind of get the whole story there in chapter 14. And now we get it again here in chapter 15. And we get it in more detail. Right, so we get to see Caleb go up to Kiriath Arba, which is from this point out known as Hebron. And he defeats the three sons of Anak. So the Anakim that we were talking about in chapter 14. These guys, Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. So the text is kind of zooming in further into the conquest. These, by the way, these are the same three guys who are mentioned by name in Numbers chapter 13, verse 22, during the spying out of the land. Right? Caleb is taking this land because that's where he was going to spy. And he came back and he gave the good report. And because he was faithful, God told him through Moses, that bit of the land that you spied out, you will get to, that'll be your inheritance. Part of his report that he brings back is about these Anakim. Right? These three guys specifically that are named in Numbers 13, verse 22, and also named here in Joshua 15, Shishai, Ahiman, and Talmai. Now, of course, what is Israel's reaction to hearing that the sons of Anak are in the land? Israel's reaction is, we're terrified. These guys are giants. They are going to destroy us. We don't stand a chance against these guys. So we will not go up into the land. So that whole story has now come around full circle. These same three guys who so terrified Israel that they disobeyed the Lord, now Caleb has finally come to their door and dealt with them. Right? Some poetic justice for the sons of Anak, and poetic closure to that part of Israel's story. All right, then, after that point, we get a whole nother set of stories that we had not received before, a pair of stories. All right, so after conquering Hebron and defeating the sons of Anak, Caleb goes up against the inhabitants of Debir. And the name of Debir, we're told, formerly was Kiryat Sefer, which means city of the book. And Caleb said, whoever strikes Kiryat Sefer and captures it, to him I will give Aksa, my daughter, as a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, captured it, and he gave him Aksa, his daughter, as a wife. So we get the story of the capture of Debir. Depending on how you read this, there's some ambiguity in verse 17. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb. All right, so which one's the brother of Caleb, Othniel or Kenaz? In English and in Hebrew, it can work either way, and there's been a lot of debate over it since ancient times. Just exactly how closely Othniel is related to Caleb. He's either Caleb's brother or he's Caleb's nephew. Either way, he captures Debir and he takes Aksa as his wife. And this creates this is just the way that land arrangements worked in the ancient world. Right? There's like a reason why we find everybody really early on in the Bible like going off and marrying their cousins and stuff like that. Because remember, there's this big concern about keeping the inheritance in the family. And so if Othniel goes in and captures Debir and marries into Caleb's household, well, the Debir stays inside of the clan. You don't have to worry about somebody outside of the clan having some of Caleb's territorial holding. So it's something that works out for them. Now, nested within this is a second story. Verse 18. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she got off her donkey, and Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negev, give me also springs of water." And he gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. All right, so the way that our English text presents it, translated off the Hebrew text, Aksa asks Othniel to ask Caleb for a field. There's a lot of confusing things going on in this story. Because the word for ask is entice or incite or mislead. Like what we read in Deuteronomy 13, verse 6, right? If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or the wife you embrace, or your friend who is your own soul, entices you in secret, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known," etc., etc. It's the same Hebrew word used there whenever she comes to him and urges him to ask her father for a field. What the ESV is translating urge there is that same word, entice. But there's nothing in the story to indicate why this would be an enticement. There's nothing to indicate that Aksa is doing anything wrong or that Othniel's doing anything wrong. There's no negative consequence attached to the request. So that's a little confusing bit about that story. On top of that, All right, so who does Aksa, so in verse 18, who is supposed to ask Caleb for the field? It's supposed to be Othniel. Right? Yeah. Then she asks him, yeah. Now there's a few things that could be going on here. The old Greek translation of this has the roles switched, where it's Othniel who comes to Aksa and urges her to ask Caleb for the field, which then, naturally goes into her going up to him and getting off the donkey and asking for a blessing. There's
sounds like he didn't do what you wanted. You went ahead and did it yourself.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Is that she really wants this blessing from Caleb, and Othniel just kind of brushes her off, and so she goes and does this for herself. And ancient interpretations have taken it in both directions. So we're really not sure exactly what's going on here. There are a couple of different lessons we could take from it. I think the one thing that does come out maybe more clearly in this text is that Caleb does give Othniel and Aksa a blessing, and it's something that comes out of his own landholding, and it's something that's really valuable, upper and lower springs, to water their land. This land, this Negev land, would not have been particularly fertile in and of itself. And so what Caleb does sets them up to prosper in the land. Which I think it's something that we're supposed to read into the broader story of Israel inhabiting the land, is that God is setting them up there to prosper. And what Caleb does in blessing them is consistent with what the Lord is doing with Israel overall. Okay. So, as confusing as this story is, by the way, it was important enough to Israel that we're going to hear this story all over again at the beginning of the book of Judges. So, we'll come back around to it eventually. Any questions or comments before we finish up today? All right. Last thing we're going to read. We're going to finish up the chapter and say a few things about it. So just get ready for the name list, because here it comes. Verse 20. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the people of Judah according to their clans. The cities belonging to the tribe of the people of Judah in the extreme south, toward the boundary of Edom, were Kebzil, Eder, Yagur, Kinah, Dimona, Adada, Kadesh, Hazor, Ithnan, Zip, Telem, Bealot, Hazar-Hadatah, Kiriot Hezron, that is Hazor, Amam, Shema, Maladah, Hazar-Gadah, Heshmon, Bet-Pelet, Hazar-Shual, Beersheba, Biziotiah, Baalah, Im, Ezem, El-Tolad, Chesil, Horma, Ziklag, Madmana, Sansana, Lebayot, Shilhim, Ain, and Rimmon, in all 29 cities with their villages. And in the lowland, Eshtaol, Zorah, Ashna, Zanoah, Enganim, Tapua, Enam, Yarmut, Adullam, Soko, Ezekah, Sha'araim, Aditaim, Gederataim, 14 cities with their villages. Zenan, Hadashah, Migdalgad, Delayan, Mizpah, Yoktil, Lachish, Bozkat, Eglon, Tabon, Lamam, Hitlish, Gederot, Bet Dagon, Naamah, and Makeda, 16 cities with their villages. Livna, Eter, Ashan, Ifta, Ashna, Nazib, Keilah, Akziv, and Merashah, 9 cities with their villages. Ekron with its towns and villages. From Ekron to the sea, all that were by the sea, the side of Ashdod, with their villages. Ashdod, its towns and its villages. Gaza, its towns and its villages, to the brook of Egypt and the great sea with its coastline. And in the hill country, Shamir, Yatir, Sako, Dana, Kiryat Shana, that is Debir, Anav, Eshtemo, Anim, Goshen, Alon, and Gilo, 11 cities with their villages. Arav, Duma, Eshan, Yanim, Bet Tapua, Afekah, Humta, Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, and Zior. 9 cities with their villages. Maon, Carmel, Ziph, Yotah, Yezreel, Yokdeam, Zanoah, Cain, Gibeah, and Timnah, 10 cities with their villages. Halhul, Zur, Gedor, Ma'arat, Betanot, and Eltekon, 6 cities with their villages. Kiryat Baal, that is Kiryat Yarim, and Rabbah, 2 cities with their villages. In the wilderness, Bet Arba, Midin, Sekakah, Nibshan, the city of Salt, and En-Gedi, 6 cities with their villages. But the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. All right, now, here's the thing. Again, what we're supposed to take away from this is Judah's prominence in Israel. The sheer magnitude of this list is meant to impress that on us. Now, the nice thing about reading this list, it might have been tedious, but here's the bonus. You will never hear of half of those cities ever again in the Bible. Literally half of these cities never appear again in the Bible outside of this list. Fully 2/3 of the cities in this list either appear just in this list or in another list just like it in Chronicles or Nehemiah. 9 of the cities in the list are also in the city list for Simeon, since Simeon's inheritance falls entirely inside of Judah's. And several of the cities along the northern border also belong to Benjamin and to Dan. So the thing is, very, very few of these cities we even ever hear about again in the Bible. Most of them you don't need to worry about. So let me point out just a couple that we should worry about. Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza. Those should sound familiar to us because they've been named already in the book. Does anyone remember what's special about these cities? Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza. I'll give you a hint. There are some other cities that are associated with them, the most famous of which is Gath. So what's special about those cities? Yes, those are cities of the Philistines. And what has the book of Joshua already told us about the Philistines? Has Israel conquered the Philistines yet? They have not. And yet 3 Philistine cities, Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza, are in the inheritance list, the city list, for the tribe of Judah. So, here's the question. Do those 3 cities belong to Judah? Ekron, Ashdod, and Gaza. Wayne?
Well, you can have an inheritance over an area,
Uh-huh.
but that doesn't mean you conquered the area.
Yes.
That means they still haven't cut like Jerusalem.
Yes.
Same thing. They
Yes.
still haven't conquered. It wasn't until David conquered it that they actually overcame those things. And even he didn't conquer the Philistines until Solomon actually took over the area of the whole of it. It was supposed to be like that then.
Yes. You've wrapped that all up pretty nice and neat for us. Because that's the whole story right there. It's like asking in Joshua chapter 1, before Israel has even crossed the river, does the promised land belong to Israel yet? God says it does. It is only up to them to walk in and take it. The same thing goes for these 3 cities. The open question at this point is, will Judah take them? And Wayne has kind of given us a preview of what's to come. It's not until much later, the reigns of King David and King Solomon, that these things start to be, that the Philistines start to be dealt with. All right, I'll let you have the last word, Wayne. It needs to be short because we've gone over time.
2 questions. One,
Yeah.
it's kind of like baptism.
Uh-huh.
God tells you you're going to be baptized to be saved. That doesn't mean you're going to do it.
Uh-huh.
You still, it's up to you to
Yeah, it's like, has Christ conquered death yet? Well, yes. There's still lots of people that died. Like, it's one of those things that it's like already but not yet. Right? So, excellent.
The second thing is there's a
Uh-huh.
lot of cities here. I always tended to think that Judah was kind of open space with a lot of wilderness.
There's like over
But
60
here
cities.
it is, all these cities here, it's like, wow, that was an overcrowded place.
I know. City, we have to understand that the word city meant something different to them than it means to us today.
Well, yeah, but it's
But still a lot of settlements. A lot of settlements. Yes.
Do you think the importance of God listing all these cities with these people in it is evidence that He fulfilled His promise to the people who are in the wilderness? And what other reason would we need to know this? Other than
Yes.
the fact that God promised you that He was going to do something.
And He did it.
And
Yeah.
this is the reason why we have this.
Yes.
When you read these cities, I feel sorry for you. I figure He's got to be winded by now. I mean, what is the importance of it? Just so we know God will fulfill.
God fulfills His promises.
What
Yes.
did it mean to them, but it doesn't mean to us with cities?
Sorry, what?
When you said the city meant something different to them than it was to us. What-
Meaning smaller size.
Oh,
Right? So like an ancient city, like we would think of as a small town today. Like a big city to us is much larger than anything the ancient world ever knew. So,
So Judah would be the size of New York City.
something like that. So, all right, thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this morning.